1962 when it was formed.
I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is a meeting of the Stormwater and Flood Committee at Bethany Beach. And we have most of our committees here. We're missing a few today due to medical issues and travel issues, but we do have a quorum today. So of our committee, Bruce Fry over here, Matt Kirks.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Last try.
And our newest member, Bob Collins, right over here, who is joining us for the first time today, was just approved, and he is a new member of the committee, but he's also a resident of Bethany Beach and the Programs and Facilities Director for the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. So I want to welcome Bob to the committee. Next of all, approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, I think we have that. And approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was back in September. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Okay. Those in
Second.
favor?
Yep.
Again, those in favor?
Aye.
Thank
Make
you.
a good team.
Okay. Our speaker today, we are extremely lucky to have Danielle Swallow from the Delaware Sea Grant, University of Delaware. She specializes in coastal hazards. Danielle has a presentation for us today on local climate change with an emphasis on the impact now and over time, including resilience options. I will turn it over to Danielle.
Okay, let's see. To the presentation, yeah. Feels like it's right there. Okay. Yeah, I'm so happy to be with you. I really enjoy interacting with your town, truthfully, and the managers that are in town. I'm Danielle Swallow with Delaware Sea Grant. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about climate and weather hazards. It's going to be, some information that's going to feel a little sobering, but I hope at the end you'll see some opportunity too. Oh, I have to turn this on, right? Okay, there we go. So I am part of NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and state-funded program at the University of Delaware that basically uses science and education and partnering to support resilient communities and economies and healthy coastal ecosystem. And we each have different roles in the office. We're essentially, most of us are essentially extension specialists, and my role is in coastal hazards. So I work with communities, help them understand weather and climate hazards, and then how to build resilience to those hazards. And I do this through outreach, like today, technical assistance, and trainings and workshops. So I'm going to start off with resilience. That word's being used a lot these days. In a nutshell, it means the ability to bounce back from disruptive events. I think of it as it starts with being very anticipatory and thinking about what situations might unfold. And since we're going to talk today about weather and climate, that's the context that I'm using. What's going to unfold in the future that one needs to better plan for and prepare for so that we can minimize the length and the frequency of the disruptions. Essentially, you can measure in terms of how long before life returns to normal. And I have that in quotes because, you may not regain all sort of the everyday functions right away. In Northeast Wilmington, just 2 years ago, residents of Northeast Wilmington got smacked by major flooding from the river due to heavy rain that dropped north in Pennsylvania from the remnants of Hurricane Ida. So there was not a direct hit of the hurricane. This was not even a hurricane when it got to Pennsylvania, but it dumped so much rain in such a short amount of time that swelled. And, they're kind of downriver and in a low-lying area. And so there are about 150 families ended up being displaced. And these happen to be lower-income families on top of that. 2 years later, we can finally say that most of them are getting back to stable housing, but some are still in temporary housing. It's taken that long. And that's too long of a disruption, right? Resiliency is about helping communities recover faster and getting back to some semblance of normalcy. So having, housing, right? It's that safe housing, food access, being able to make ends meet. And so from a community context, that's what Bethany Beach needs to think about too. Whether you're having just intermittent tidal flooding as a disruptive event or something more significant, is how can we minimize the frequency and intensity of these disruptions and the length. It's kind of a busy slide here, but this is sort of a graphic showing, in terms of our built infrastructure, how an aging set of infrastructure can have a harder time recovering and returning back to normal operation. So if you imagine, like if Route 1, right, if DelDOT didn't keep up with the paving and with even elevating the road a few inches, in portions of it like they did years past, and you have a significant flooding event, that road is out of commission, right, for a series of hours or a day, and that has a big impact, right? So an aging road system may take longer, to recover. There may be a lot of holes and structural issues with the asphalt, but if it's maintained well, and if it's elevated to some degree, then potentially the amount of flooding might be minimal, maybe a couple inches. So maybe instead of a whole day out of commission, it's only a couple hours. Things like that can reduce the amount of time that infrastructure is out of service. And that goes for, our physical, gray infrastructure like roads and stormwater systems, but it also includes our natural infrastructure, our wetlands. Like if we have healthy wetlands that are well maintained and allowed to migrate with, the advancement of sea level rise, they're going to be able to take on additional storm surge and even, sea level rise over time with that, and still maintain their functionality, which is to store water, to attenuate waves, to provide habitat, and so forth. But if they're already degraded to begin with, if they're like boxed in, they're going to have a harder time maintaining some of that functionality and coming back to full functionality. So resilience at a community context is really a very integrative, kind of comprehensive thing. We have to think about infusing resilience into all aspects of planning and operations. So whether it's our land use planning, like how we build and design our communities, how we design our infrastructure. It could include emergency operations, like planning for how we're going to carry out response and then recovery, how we maintain our natural resources. And it also, factors into social and economic planning, thinking about business resiliency here, right? Are the businesses here doing enough to think about impacts that climate change may have on their businesses, so that if the power goes out for an extended period of time and they rely on refrigeration, what are their backup protocols, things like that. So I just encourage folks to integrate future conditions into all of the planning throughout the process of community planning, so that it's just one of those other things that you have to factor, just like you factor economics, the economy and population growth. So with that, comes needing a deeper understanding of the hazards that you're living with and what it means to have risks from those hazards. So here I'm listing the 4 major components of flooding in Delaware, and I think I've got individual slides for these. So we have heavy rain events, which are totally outside of our, coastal storms. These are just like thunderstorms, that drop a lot of rain in a short amount of time that could overwhelm, your storm water systems, and, low-lying parts of the roads may get wet and so forth. And then you know this better than I that, there's coastal storms, right? Like our nor'easters, which is actually like we tend to get walloped by those a little more even than the tropical ones. But even remnants of tropical systems, like a subtropical storm Melissa, which was offshore, didn't ever make landfall in this area, can still bring with it, depending on the direction of the winds, how long it's offshore, it can bring a buildup of tide, and then you've got standing water for a long period of time. Of course, nor'easters and tropical systems can bring a lot of wind, a lot of erosion, and other kinds of impacts. So I know you all know better than I do what coastal storms bring for this area. I do want to say that there's research now that's really starting to mature called attribution science, which is looking at the role that climate change is playing in our hurricanes. And what we see is that it is contributing to the intensification of hurricanes, how much rainfall they may drop. It's not yet, or it's not in contributing to the frequency, like how many hurricanes make landfall in the U.S., although they are seeing more storms in general in the Atlantic Basin. But there's a reported 17% decrease in the speed of movement of storms, of these hurricanes, in the North Atlantic Basin since 1900, as well as an increased tendency along the North American coast for them to meander and stall. So that has, bearing on this area, I think, too, because if storms are stalling and taking longer, to track forward, that could potentially mean more rainfall, right? Maybe more wind. So you can have impacts there that are maybe magnified compared to what we observed in the past. And another type of flooding is our high tide flooding, which I think you also know very well about here. And NOAA has like a really great outlook, and I have the link there at the bottom. That's really looking at not only the recorded observations of high tide flooding, which is simply flooding in low-lying areas absent any real storm event. That's what high tide flooding is. So when you get a high tide, or it's particularly full moon, that kind of situation, you're gonna have low-lying flooding in certain spots of town. And we've seen a 200% increase in the Northeast since 2000 in the number of days of high tide flooding. And NOAA provides an outlook, and they base it on the 2 NOAA tide gauges for our region. There's ones up and down the whole coastline of the U.S., but there's 2 in Delaware. The closest one to you is Lewis, and we can observe, a doubling of the number of days since 10 years ago, and then we can see projected out, depending on how many, what the world does with greenhouse gas emissions, but based on sort of a conservative estimate, we're going to see, upwards of 60 or more days, per year of high tide flooding in the lowest lying parts of our state. And all of that, essentially is being exacerbated by sea level rise, which appears as an increase in the average height of our tides. So our low tides are getting higher and our high tides are getting higher each and every day. And our rate in Delaware of sea level rise is twice the global average. And that rate's accelerating, right? And it's really tied to global warming, the warming of the oceans. As water warms, it expands. That's the #1 contributor to sea level rise, but there are some other contributors. I could talk about that in just a second, but this is showing you the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is a great tool that you can use to look at 1-foot increments to see and visualize flood risk. This is, of course, based on a sunny day. This does not capture storminess. This is just capturing sea level rise. And that's showing 2 feet. So why do we have, a higher rate of sea level rise compared to the global average? Well, there's just other phenomena going on, some of which is kind of like normal and natural and not necessarily man-made, and other parts that are a little more man-made. But essentially, we have a weakening Gulf Stream. And that Gulf Stream, when it's really strong and doing what it's supposed to do, it's going to pull water off our coast. But because it's slackening, that water is kind of piling up. And I'm just talking about millimeters and centimeters, but it's piling up along our coastline. And in addition, the ice sheets, like in the Antarctic and Greenland, they have a lot of mass, and that mass has a lot of gravitational pull. And that mass actually pulls water toward it, even from our coast. But as the ice sheets are losing mass, that gravitational pull is weakening, and that water, again, is piling a little bit up more toward our coast. And that has a latitude connection to it, so we're just happening to be more in a region that has more of that effect than maybe south of us. And then we experience some natural subsidence, some of which is a holdover from the last ice age. So, I've been working in this field for quite a while, and I can see year to year the state of science evolving, and I find it really amazing that the U.S. now has very high confidence in what we will see in terms of sea level rise within the next 30 years. There's always some degree of uncertainty with climate science because we're trying to really understand a lot of different variables that are at play, including what the world as a whole will do to rein in greenhouse gas emissions. The more they rein it in, the slower the rate of acceleration of sea level rise, for example. Then we can't control all that, so there's uncertainty with that. And then there's uncertainty in how our ice sheets behave, and how the structural integrity of the ice sheets, what will happen over time? How quickly will we lose some of the ice sheets and the mass, the calving of the ice into the ocean? And so there's definitely still some uncertainty, particularly as you go toward the end of the century. But now there's high confidence in what we can see within the next 30 years. And that's because they've been able to extrapolate observed sea level rise out, and it matches up with all the models. So what we're basically saying, we as in the science and climate community, is that by 2050, moderate flooding is expected to occur on average more than 10 times as it does today. And on average, we'll see as much sea level rise here over the next 30 years as we've seen in the past 100 years. So we've had a little over a foot in the past 100 years. We should anticipate at least a foot to a foot and a half over the next 30 years. Not great news, right? But this is us having to face a paradigm shift where we're going to just see more frequency of high tide flooding days and more moderate types of flooding impacts than potentially we do today. So I took this off your website, which is, I think your town is doing so many good things, and you have a lot of good information sources on your website. So this is showing, I can't read that over there, the flooding zones, showing kind of the areas of town that are gonna experience more routine, flooding on high tide days, or I guess if there's some offshore weather compared to others. So the orangey spots are the more frequent zones, right? I guess I look at this and I say, okay, thinking about that paradigm shift, those zones are going to have even more, days of potential, flooded spots, and then the gray areas potentially become, the next category up, which will see more days than they do now. So it's like everything shifts. Maybe imagine the colors. Maybe orange gets replaced by new color, and that gray becomes more of the orange color. That's how I would think about it. But I'd be curious too how your town, you know your town best, how you might think about it. Where might be areas that are going to experience more days that come to a point where it's really a nuisance for you, and really impacts kind of what you need to do day in and day out. So the other thing that I notice that's going on is sort of like all this new information just keeps coming out. More research, more science coming out. Some of it's a little sobering. The fifth National Climate Assessment was just released this week. So I was busy yesterday trying to read through it all, and there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of it. But this is the U.S. government's consensus report on the state of climate change. It's a consensus report, so here's the nation's leading scientists agreeing on what the impacts are. And they're not prescribing policies in this, they're just stating kind of what we're seeing on the ground. So bottom line is we're seeing impacts that are unprecedented in any of the Earth's recorded history. They can look back 800,000 years and extrapolate, the climate from then, and they don't see anything that compares to the warming and the rate of warming that we see now. And they also see evidence that weather extremes are being felt in every region of the country. I think about this past summer when we were feeling the effects of wildfires up in Canada, right? I live in Lewis. I know in Lewis we were. I don't know if the smoke came as south here, but it was, it was noticeable. Like it was a situation, and happened to coincide with some of our heat waves on top of that, which, was challenging for some people that work outdoors or have, health issues. This report is also saying that, U.S.-wise, we've done a fair job of like reining in greenhouse gas emissions. We just haven't done a deep enough job, and globally is lagging behind sort of what's needed to rein in, the risks. So we're going to continue to see an acceleration, and we're going to start to see potentially more of a probability of some areas experiencing 2 or more events co-occurring or occurring in like close succession with one another, which is called compound events. So I think of that like wildfire smoke coupled with a heat wave, like just something that's layered on top of the other, and now we're dealing with both. But I think the biggest takeaway that I want to leave with you is that the nation's science community is saying our current adaptation efforts nationwide, they're growing. There's evidence all around that it's growing, but it's still insufficient to reduce the risks and keep pace with what we're going to see into the future. So I go back to risks and making sure that we can talk about risk and understand really what contributes to risk, because when we understand risk, we can do more to mitigate and adapt to that risk. So risk is really the intersection, right, of a hazard, in this case we're talking about like flooding, with exposure and vulnerability. And exposure refers to the people, the property, and like the infrastructure and systems that are in the path of that hazard. And just because you're in the path of that hazard does not necessarily mean you're going to be vulnerable. That's more having to do with your sensitivity to it and your ability to adapt to it. So I like to think about, in terms of people, who are the folks within the community that are more at risk? Who are going to be more sensitive? This could be our older adults. It could be, folks with particular health challenges like asthma. It could be lower income individuals. They're potentially going to have a disproportionate, impact. They're going to be more sensitive and maybe have less adaptive capacity. I think of older adults in this regard because, particularly because folks are living, if they're retired, they're on a fixed income, and maybe the equity is tied up in their home. Maybe their home's paid off and they drop their flood insurance, which is dropping their risk protection. And so, then how quickly can they recover from a major event? Land uses, like property-wise, we can think about our land use practices as increasing or decreasing sensitivity and improving adaptive capacity. So if we have a really strong freeboard, ordinance, right, and the town has one that, encourages the elevation of property, that can improve adaptive capacity to something that's sensitive. But if the codes aren't keeping up with the risk, then that can minimize adaptive capacity and increase vulnerability. And likewise, the condition of our infrastructure. And it goes back to that functionality chart. If we're maintaining that infrastructure in good condition, it's going to be a little less sensitive and potentially have more ability to adapt compared to those that are, not as maintained. So that's really the graph here. So essentially, the higher the sensitivity of something and the lower adaptive capacity means it's more vulnerable. So if you have a basement inside the floodplain, that's going to be particularly sensitive to flooding, and maybe there's fewer adaptation options unless you fill it in. Or a wetland that has room is potentially sensitive to flooding because it's right on the coast, right, to having the effects of sea level rise. But if it has room to migrate inland, then there's that adaptive capacity, which makes it less vulnerable overall. So, thinking about that, we can then apply that to decisions that we make at a community scale to help improve adaptive capacity. So basically the goal is, right, to reduce exposure and decrease vulnerability. So certain types of adaptation and mitigation options basically can fall into 4 categories. And this is particularly in relation to like our infrastructure projects. We have projects that can like protect and basically keep water out, like bulkheads and strong dune system. And then we have, projects that are more about accommodating the water. So allowing water to pass through or, be absorbed. So bioretention, bioswales, rain gardens, are examples of that, and elevation of utilities and houses are another example. And then you have the whole other example of category, which is like avoiding, right? We could choose not to build in the floodplain. I realize that's a little difficult when a town is mostly inside the floodplain. I realize that. In this case, it's hard to see out of that photo, but there's like wetland area that's not built on as compared to the other barrier island over there. And then you have retreat, right, which is thinking about relocating. That's a very loaded word, and it brings up a lot of feeling in people for good reason. But I don't think retreat has to mean a wholesale relocation of any one town, to an inland location. I think of it as sometimes just choosing to think about maybe not adding an extension of a home, like a 3rd bedroom or whatever, in an area that's particularly low-lying on your property, no longer maintaining the shed on your property. It could mean that, maybe a community invests more in one part of town than the other because the first part of town is going to have a better probability of being able to accept floodwater and manage and adapt. What doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is that it takes more than looking at our physical and our natural infrastructure to adapt to climate change, especially now that we know what's happening and what's coming. We've really got to invest equally in the civic and social capacity of our towns and our county and so forth. Because ultimately, we could design for the best stormwater mitigation projects around. But maybe there's going to be a storm event that is just like a superstorm Sandy or something that just really wallops the area. And it's going to exceed that design, what that infrastructure was designed for. And there's just going to be a lot of disruption and a lot of impact. And we have to be thinking about what then, right? If the community is unfortunate that it's hit that hard by some sort of event, and look at Hurricane Ian in Florida. I mean, there's examples all around of these really large-scale events. Those communities were really, impacted in every level. So you may not be able to rebuild within a few days. This may be months or even years. So we have to shore up the resilience of the community, because if you have folks that are in the community that are struggling now to make ends meet, then they're going to have a harder time, recovering later. And if you can grow the capacity of the town and the civic infrastructure, to respond, then there are going to be more services and abilities available, to help a town get through this. And I think Bethany Beach has a lot of good capacity now. And really what you've done over the years, you've done quite a lot. I think you're one of the standouts in the state. I really do. I think that there's always room for more, right? But you're a small town, and this can be challenging. We have that up and down, the county here. But I think it means really understanding who your vulnerable population is. You're in an affluent area, but there's still pockets of deep vulnerability here. You have an outsized proportion of older adults, some of whom are going to not be as well off. Who are they and where are they? Do they have family support systems in town or in the state? My outreach, it shows that a lot of times their support systems are outside of the state. And how can we reduce some of the inequities in terms of proximity to services, access and available social services for folks that are vulnerable? How can we beef up our emergency operations and recovery planning? So we're thinking about not just response, but also, the days and weeks afterward. I noted on your website that you have a VIPs, the voluntary police service.
Volunteers and Police Service.
Yeah, I thought that was a really great idea. We're going to need more second responders. Not first responders. Well, we need more first responders. But the folks that can come in and supplement, not necessarily with the hard search and rescue kinds of things, but more like offering support with traffic directions, helping people get back in their homes, maybe mucking out, the muddy water, that's in some people's first floors. And there's groups, in Delaware that are available, like the Delaware VOAD, which stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. It's made of groups like the Red Cross and United Way and Team Rubicon, and they were in Northeast Wilmington mucking out the basements of all those homes. They were cutting limbs and trees that fell during the Dover tornado. Those kinds of volunteer groups can be incredibly important in helping out and helping boost recovery and resilience. Just thinking about how to build redundancy into town operations, your IT systems, making sure they're redundant, that you have your communications channels, worked out so that, if the power's down, internet's down, and cell's down for a period of time, there's still a mechanism to communicate. Weaving future conditions into all the town planning, which I mentioned before. Thinking about early warning systems that can help let people know when to expect, a high tide flooding event, for example, and really continuing to invest in education and outreach and building volunteers and social networks. Like you have a Village Volunteers group down here that is helping to support the needs of older adults. That's one such group, but there's others, and really working to cultivate those can be terrific. And then finding ways to bring in the private sector as a partner, because not only do they have potential more resources, but they can help amplify the needs of others. So the 5th National Climate Assessment talks about the need for more transformative adaptation. So we're doing a lot of good things now, and dealing with one project here, one project there. Maybe it's a little piecemeal, and we've got to think more broadly about very comprehensive approaches. And this slide has a couple of examples. But I think about like a community like Bethany Beach, I think you're pretty built out, right? So what are the opportunities then? Maybe it's not so much in the area of where to direct new housing and how you're going to design and site the new housing, but maybe it's more about redevelopment. So how one redevelops their properties, or thinking about a recovery plan so that, God forbid, if there is a big event and there is some housing stock that's been severely impacted, how would you want to rebuild? Could this present a unique opportunity to maybe not build in the same footprint as before? And having some of those plans in place, some vision for that, can be really helpful, because if you're going through that event, you're not going to have the time to be thinking about that, and then you're going to have opportunistic folks coming in who are going to want to build in the same footprint. Okay, so I know that's a lot. Mind blown. Let's shake this off a little bit, because it's a lot. I recognize that. And I'm in the field, and it's like some days it's just like, man, there's a lot here. But I think there are some really, important opportunities here. And the worst thing I think that we can do to ourselves is say, this is too overwhelming, and I'm not going to do anything about it, right? I'm just going to pretend it's here, and that's it. Or, maybe I won't be around in 20 years, so who cares? Well, I hope that's not the answer, right? I hope that we see that we have to act now, and we have to be really imaginative about it, and really lean on one another, and really all get involved. I think it's an all hands on deck kind of moment, but there's lots of opportunities here to leave a legacy and to really reimagine, the future, how this community and other communities can evolve. And so I just want to leave you with that. I think there's lots of room for adaptive management here and elsewhere, like where whatever the approaches are, it's okay to flex and pivot as time goes on and new information comes out. You don't have to lock yourself into one plan and then that's what you're going to execute for the next 30 years. You have to build in opportunities to pause and consult the latest science and think about what the latest needs are. But I think it's also incredibly important that communities really discern what their values are and what their needs are versus their wants, because needs and wants are different. And look, we're in a coastal town, right? I live in Lewis, like we're all in this together, and we're not potentially going to be able to mitigate our way out of everything, right? We're surrounded by water, so we're going to have to learn to live with water. So what's the vision going forward? Maybe it's time to really think more broadly about adaptation and build a plan around that. Be really inventive and creative and really get to what's most important. What assets are most at risk in the town? Not just your physical infrastructure, your social infrastructure as well. And how are you going to prioritize that? Like looking to see what's most at risk and then prioritizing what does the town have the most control over? And maybe the town ultimately decides it's going to pour its energy into, I'm just rattling off, like the town infrastructure that the town controls. Maybe the town can never have enough money in the world for all the mitigation work that maybe needs to be done. So it's going to bring in private sector partners. Maybe, I don't know, like maybe they have to think about areas of town where we're going to just work to live with water more often, and areas of town where we're going to keep dry, like things like that. And then it's just vitally important that the mitigation work that the town does is also coupled with adaptation work, so that in addition to trying to reduce risk through your stormwater projects and dune, beach nourishment, you're also thinking about your social, your population, your social infrastructure, and how are you going to help them adapt and build resilience into their world. And, I think these things individually can really make a big difference. And the important thing is there are partners out there to assist the town. And you guys have done an amazing amount of work already that I have really good feeling about your town. Like, I think your town can be a true leader for the state in thinking about how coastal communities learn to adapt and thrive. And it may look a little different than today's version of thriving, but it's going, it's doable. I think it's really doable. So I'll leave you with that we're in a new normal. And it's just gonna take us embracing that we have change and then thinking more comprehensively about the steps that need to take place. And I'm here to answer any questions and also support you in that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Can we open it for questions? Anybody got any thoughts or questions? There must be something.
Shell-shocked? I know.
It's a broad topic, and you don't know what questions to ask. So
I'd be curious if there was anything that stuck out to you the most, in terms of what you learned today.
obviously, Danielle, the water level in 2050 is right there, so.
Yeah.
Excuse me, could we, I mean, we're online and we try to,
Sorry. You said it was mostly from thermal expansion? It's not from the Greenland and Antarctica, the glaciers?
Thermal expansion is, I think, the leading contributor overall to global sea level rise, and then the ice sheet melting is like, I think, the next one. But yeah, there's lots of components, but thermal expansion is the biggest, yeah.
Just as a matter of perspective, when I started working on climate change, the estimates for sea level rise were about a foot by 2100.
Yes, right. No, and it's evolved, right? And that sometimes can keep people from wanting to act well, wait, we'll just wait and see what it says in 5 years, you know. But we've also gotten much better, you know, at measuring. We have a longer set of observational data now, and we can utilize that to really extrapolate out. So yeah, the confidence is going up, especially in the near term. But there's still, you know, there's still really like some uncertainty about like how much rise we'll see in 2100. Yeah.
Thank you.
do we have another question? Thought I saw another arm go up. Well, it's the people that are online that, and if you would state where, you know, your name and your address, if you would.
Sure. It's Green Gravet. I'm in Lake Bethany, which is just one of those that floods. Have you all studied some of the some mitigation that does work?
Oh, beach nourishment works. You know, the dunes do a terrific job in terms of helping to control sort of the storm surge impacts that could arise, right? Of course, you know, what you experience is that sometimes we have storms blow through where it chops a whole lot. There's a whole lot of scarping and erosion of your beach face, and then it's like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. And yes, because you're gonna have to replenish, but it's the dunes doing their job, right? They're taking that hit for you. So that's a great example. Wetlands are like, they're like, I think I call them like nature's best defense against nature, because they just do so much. They provide so many benefits to a community. But yeah, there's lots of research out there in terms of natural infrastructure. If, you know, everything's got to be taken case by case, but the more in general that we can invest in our natural infrastructure, the better, because not only does it do generally a good job at, you know, fighting some of these flood risks, for example, but they are providing other benefits too, and you can leverage that, you know, because, you know, the cost, you could say, well, the cost is also bringing water quality improvements and air quality or aesthetic improvements or habitat improvements and stuff like that, whereas, you know, your hardened infrastructure doesn't necessarily do that.
One thing, you know, to follow up here, and some of the future, you know, other things are going to be discussed in the meeting, the town is taking a number of steps that will assist various areas to become a little more resilient. Certainly, Lake Bethany is one of them. I mean, you guys are the epicenter over there. But, you know, one of the epicenters. There's several others, but so we'll cover some of that after Danielle. But
Yeah, and I just want to say the town's been, at least from my point of view, very proactive in partnering and attending forums that are put on by RASCL, the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League. You can go to derascal.org for information on our events. We have one on our annual summit's going to be on renewable energy on January 17th. But the town's just been very good. They're involved in the Association of Coastal Towns. So they're doing really good things to try to leverage networks, and which helps to amplify the needs and get state and federal interest, you know, in projects. And so I know the town's been very good about going after some of that funding.
Yeah, the town has been good at pursuing whatever we can as far as grants, and money is the big issue. It's a major issue. So,
Thank you.
yep, thank you, Danielle. Moving on in our agenda, I'm going to turn it over to Cliff, our town manager, to update us on a number of the initiatives that the town is working on.
I'll just go through the next four, one after the other.
Go ahead.
All right. The first thing on the agenda is replenishment. Replenishment is obviously done. For those who don't know, this was an unusual replenishment project. It's the first time the state has replenished 5 coastal communities at the same time, and they did that with $23.5 million. The last time both Bethany and South Bethany Beach were fully replenished and the dune fully restored, it just about cost that amount. The result of those dollars being divided like that was that our beach was elevated, the dune wasn't replenished, the beach was restored, if you will, but nothing was put on the dune, and the beach was only restored from Wellington Parkway to Ocean View Parkway. With that, the only place the dune fence was replaced was in front of the project area from Ocean View to Millville. Strangely enough, when the contract was let, the fence was laid out to be laid out in the area where the dune used to be. So when you see the gap between the edge of the current dune and that fence, that is where the dune was supposed to be. They didn't amend the contract or change the contract to bring the fence back. And it looks a little different. We didn't have any issues with that towards the end of the summer. But we've also gone to the time and effort to buy additional snow fence. And we have enough snow fence to do the south end of the town from from Wellington Parkway south to the town limits. We'll do that as summer approaches. We don't want to put the snow fence up now and then find it in March in Ocean City. So we'll get that done here as the year goes on. We have been told, though, that our next replenishment project, that our congressional delegation has made a real effort to make this happen, that the next replenishment project should be a complete restoration of the original project that we had a number of years ago that created the dune and replenished the beach fully, and that's certainly good news. We have talked a lot about mitigation, and Bethany Beach is putting a lot of time, effort, and energy and hope into the idea that a dam at the confluence of the Loop Canal and the Assawoman would do much to alleviate the flooding that we see here in our community. You saw Danielle's map of the bronze area and the gray area, and we know how often we see that type of flooding. We don't see the gray area yet, but we know it's coming. This dam is a dam that will be steel. You will be able to raise it and lower it. You can raise it in anticipation of storms. And the dam will be about 3 foot high. That will take care of about 95% of the type of flooding we see. It won't prevent flooding from a megastorm where when we see tidal waters top the 3, but in order to make sure that the dam does not impact surrounding communities, the dam will lower at 3 feet. And we know, and we're very, very confident at this point in time, that the dam, as being planned, will not impact any other community. This Friday, the town council will vote on advancing the project even farther when they vote on a contract from McCormick Taylor to complete the dam design. That contract is for $378,000. It includes all environmental assessments, all final permitting that's needed, a preliminary draft design and a final design, and a number of public meetings. That takes us to where we need to be in terms of the dam's construction, and what we do need, as Mr. Califf just mentioned, are the dollars to proceed. The dam, by many standards, could be considered reasonable in cost for construction. It's roughly $2 million. We've already invested $244,000 in the dam design. The additional $378 and oversight for the project will probably bring the total cost to about $3 million. But again, by many of the projects that we see, we know other people apply for and receive funding for, that's something we hope is something we can find the dollars to complete. We have worked for a while, mainly because of permitting issues, to save the land spit between Lake Bethany and the Loop Canal. That's been problematic with picking up permitting from Delaware, but in working with our engineers, and Terry Tiemann has spearheaded this for us and done a great job with it. In working with our engineers, we've discovered that if we take our plan to bulkhead that spit and move it just a little bit south, then we can circumvent legally and properly with permission of the United States Corps of Engineers and DENREC any permitting issues and can move the project ahead more quickly. We've picked up about $225,000 of the estimated total, was it $1 million? $1 million cost, and we're seeking additional monies from our state legislators in this budget cycle to help us complete that. One of the things we're also looking at is the dredging of the Loop Canal. The dredging of the Loop Canal doesn't have any immediate benefit, nothing that people can really speak about or speak to as a benefit with flooding, but we know that it's become problematic, that the fact that it's no longer navigable, and on many occasions you could walk across the Loop Canal in different areas. We have just had a recent conversation with the engineers that are reviewing that for us, and one of the things that we have looked at and had been problematic in the past was what we would do with the sediment that was removed from the loop. Sometimes that sediment in and of itself could be very toxic and very hard to place, and we're pleased to know that this sediment is generally fine sand with very few issues. And in addition to that, in terms of placement, there's an interest in the part of the Army National Guard in Delaware to use some of that sediment to restore the marshland on the west side of their complex. And that would be a very, very good thing for Bethany because that makes disposal easy. And at the same time, there may be potential, because that sediment will help protect the guard camp, that there may be funding, possibly from the federal level, to help facilitate the placement of that sediment, which would again help with our project. We looked a lot here. We use our own set of tidal gauges, and I think Daniel's probably seen what we have on our site where we have our own town tidal gauge. And the tidal gauge is right at Route 1, and you can go to our website and you can correlate what you see in that tidal gauge to actual flooding in the community. Unfortunately, maintaining that tidal gauge has been problematic here over the last year and a half or so. But we're fortunate now to be entering into a partnership with the Delaware Geological Service and the U.S. Geological Service to make that gauge one of their gauges that'll be up on their national site. And in addition to that, we'll be adding 2 other tidal gauges to to what we have, what we control, but it will be part of the U.S. Geological Service's tidal gauge operation. You'll be able to pull it up anytime, anywhere on their websites. One of those gauges will be at the confluence of the Assawoman, the other gauge of the Assawoman and the Loop Canal, and then one at the mouth of the Assawoman Canal at White's Creek. All of that will help us with the operation of our dam, but also will add a lot of information regarding flooding in this area. The council will vote, hopefully again this Friday, an additional $139,000 for the 5 years, next 5 years, for the installation and maintenance of those gauges. So that's a good step forward for us in terms of us monitoring what's going on in the community. Mr. Califf, that's all I have.
That was quite a bit. I'm sure there's probably a question or two out there. Hold on. Can we get a microphone? Or up there? Up there is fine. And please state your name and address, if you would, please.
Patrick Shepley, 944 Pine Tree Lane in Lake Bethany. Cliff, my question is on the plantings on the dunes. Has that happened? Is it going to happen?
It's going to happen. I'm not sure why it hasn't yet, but it's scheduled and paid for, so
Okay.
it's going to happen.
Good. Thank you.
Eric Sells now. I also live in Lake Bethany. We're taking over. No, just kidding. So,
That's what Councilman Shepley tells me all the time.
yes.
So.
Why do you think we had him on our board? So what is the official parameters of the Loop Canal? Is it just from the salt pond to the town, or where does it start?
So
When
the
you
Loop
define
Canal,
the Loop
the Loop Canal
where-
is, as we speak of it, is what the people who founded the community in 1901 or 2 constructed. It goes from the Assoman all the way across Route 1 to the actual loop itself.
Yep.
So for purposes of dredging, as we talk about that, because of cost issues, and it's going to be very hard to mobilize any type of equipment east of Route 1, this dredging project would go from Route 1 to the Assoman,
Where on the Assawoman?
to the mouth of the Assoman. It ends.
All the way down to White's Creek, or?
No, so, no, 2 different things. The Loop Canal and the Assoman Canal are 2 separate entities.
I know, that's what I'm
Yes,
trying to
yeah.
determine where one starts and the other goes. And the other starts.
It ends where
Just
the,
trying to
it
verify
it
that.
ends where the loop meets the Assoman.
Okay,
Okay.
so where it hits into the Assawoman,
Yes.
right on the corner
Right.
behind our community. Okay. All right, thank you. My second question is this. Nice to hear about the National Guard need, but I can tell you that the smaller pond on the very south end of the salt pond is also a dying marsh. Jack and Joan have been watching a lot longer than I have. In the 5 years I've lived there, 6 years, you can see the marsh dying. So it'd be nice to help out the National Guard, but if there's any conversation about getting rid of the spoils from any dredging, and I talked to Denrek about this, and the inland bays person, not our friend on the panel here, but somebody else. Anyway, I would just like to, suggest that you consider trying to save that pond and those marshes as well. I don't know if it's a
So
wetland
if
or
you
marsh.
look at that from an aerial photo, and you'll look at the marsh behind the Gordon's home, and you'll see an open area that appears to be marsh that's degraded and holding water with no marsh in it. And that's what you're speaking of. Years ago, when we first had the idea of possibly dredging and moving spoils, we went to Denrek with that, and Denrek doesn't identify that as a piece of marsh that needs to be rehabilitated. They have a different nomenclature for it, and they say no to restoration of that piece. The area around all that marshland directly behind the Gordons, between there and the banks of the nature center, if you will,
Right.
that could be open to restoration, but it doesn't need it as much as the land spit needs some additional sediment placed on it, and the property with the guard becomes more appealing, especially if they can assist with funding the project.
Right. Well, there's other parts of that area that could look at. I'd love to show you
Sure.
next time you're in the neighborhood, but, I just, when they were last summer taking all those spoils down to South Bethany, it made no sense to pump it that far from the dredging on the Assawoman, right? You could have saved a mile at least of transporting that stuff. So anyway, I just want to put it out there as another alternative that could.
Sure.
That could be
And we're
looked
aware of the area, but I think what you're speaking of is something that Denrek
at. Whole
would
area
not.
behind Jack and Joan's house.
Well, the one gut in particular looks like it needs to be rehabilitated, but it's not actually a marsh. So,
Just wanted to make sure I
Yes.
got in the notes. Thank you.
And dredging on the Assoman itself is still scheduled, I think, for this,
it's supposed to be forthcoming, yes.
yeah, this off-season.
This
coming up
off-season.
This fall and through the winter. Other questions? That's it? Surprise, okay. Thank you very much for your questions. Moving on to our next item of discussion, I wanted to just discuss a little bit our pamphlet on homeowner fights flooding, which we put out in September, and it has been received rather well. Actually, I just had a request for an adjacent community to use it, to post it in their community, which would be great. The more people that see it, the better. Please pass it on to your neighbors, to your friends, those people that aren't, your friends and neighbors who are not here during most of the year, who most of the time have no idea that we have flooding and issues. They're here during the summer months and the good times of the year. I also wanted to thank several of the town HOAs, including Lake Bethany and including Bethany West, distributed this in some of their meetings, which, wonderful. Thank you for doing that. BBLA has also been distributing our pamphlet. And we've been able to, as you can, if you check the town website now, it is posted. You can actually see the pamphlet right on the homepage. There's a connection. And it's, of course, in the flood information page of the town website. And I wanted to thank Julie as well because she has placed a reference to this up on our life-saving station message board, which reaches out to many people. Do we have any further discussions on any thoughts or comments from the committee relative to our efforts
With the pamphlet?
with the pamphlet? Right.
Yeah, I think it's going along well.
Yeah. Del Dot, would you care to?
Sure. The Delaware Department of Transportation, to its credit, is doing more than they have in a very long time to take a look at evacuation issues and making sure that Route 1 is an open and viable roadway to be used for evacuation purposes, which it is not today, as anyone who lives here for any period of time knows. They're doing some immediate things. They've already done some things on Route 1 in terms of elevating the roadway. They're taking a lot of time, effort, and energy to look at something they might be able to do immediately just north of the Indian River Inlet where the road washes over all the time. But they have some long-term plans, immediate things north of the inlet to elevate the roadway and to take care of that spot just north of the inlet, and also south of Bethany in the areas near Fenwick. All of us that live here know that if you want to think about evacuating, though, you want to evacuate out Route 26, and the town is, when we have conversations with DelDOT about that, we talk to them about Vines Creek, how it's a real choke point and a real issue for us. And we've also identified an area on Route 26 that we have issues with from flooding from the Asselman that washes up and closes 26. So we brought that to their attention the last time we had met with them. They're aware of it, and I think they may take a look at that going forward with the Department of Natural Resources. But they're also taking a real long view, I mean, a view 20, 30, 40 years out on potential things they may need to do to keep Route 1 open and viable. And it's an interesting dialogue, nothing immediately on the table, but again, kudos to them for doing that. So.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, most of their efforts, at least in the near term, are going to be up around the inlet and north of there. And Bethany actually sits in a pretty good position.
We have one little spot that we have not really seen. We've seen water hit the roadway at the loop, but we don't have a real issue, nothing like Fenwick does, and nothing like the Route 1 from Dewey to the inlet. So,
okay. Committee members, do we have any further discussion on any topics?
I don't.
Okay, well, I want to thank Danielle again. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for coming down and helping us out. And Cliff, as always, for covering all the issues in town and where we stand and the efforts that the town is putting forward. So with that, I will call for adjourn. Do we have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Second. Those in favor?
Good job.
glad I came.
Aye. Thank you very much for coming.
Danielle, question.
No, we have never voted against that.